The OpenChain project held a steering committee meeting on October the 23rd, adjacent to Open Source Summit Europe. The steering committee of the OpenChain project is designed to provide a formal method for voting on suggestions around the direction of the OpenChain specification and the project in general. The steering committee is open to everyone to observe, though the voting members are restricted to governing board members of the OpenChain project, work team leads of the OpenChain project, and an elected community representative. This meeting, on the 23rd of October, marked our last steering committee meeting for 2018. The focus was on ensuring consensus around key aspects of the OpenChain specification as we move forward into 2019 and a formal standardization process.
Thank you. As we kick off the steering committee meeting, please note that if you're not part of the governing board, you're still welcome to sit in. The steering committee has voting members from our governing board, our work team leads, and our elected community representative. But anyone can sit in and listen into what we're up to. This committee meeting will take approximately 30 minutes from this point. And what we're going to do in this steering committee is essentially rethread our topics from the previous committee, where we had a slight lack of consensus or some concerns raised. And we're going to talk about how we have addressed those concerns and then double check if we've got consensus with the voting members. By the way, for those on the line, just as with the workshop, please jump in at any point. Now, if you can see the slides, I'm presuming that they're sharing well on Uber Conference as well as here. This is the purpose and the participants of the steering committee from a formal sense. The idea of the steering committee is to give us some of the structure that we see in something like ISO committees, that we have a formal way to vote and either to adopt new motions or to resolve situations where we have two competing motions. The basic idea is that we have a formal mechanism for voting around the specification, and we also have a formal mechanism for making any critical decisions on areas like curriculum or how we do conformance. The outcomes of this steering committee form recommendations that go before our governing board for final ratification. All of that sounds pretty formal, and in practice, the steering committee is not so formal. Mostly what we're doing is a sanity check to see if we've got consensus, and if we don't have consensus, to see if we can find a way to resolve concerns. The agenda today is to talk about the OpenChain training requirement and the OpenChain organization definition in the specification. So these are two things that are at the core of the OpenChain spec and are of interest to us this year because we will iterate the specification. Welcome. Come in. We will iterate the specification with an eye to submitting to the ISO fast track process in April 2019 and completing the ISO fast track process around January or February 2020. The training requirement of the OpenChain spec is something that's quite important. This is something that was slightly contentious, and it led to discussion the last time around. In essence, we have discovered from feedback that software staff are not always the key inflection point for open source compliance training. Many companies, software staff are critical for training, but some companies do not train their software staff. They train other people who are the gateways to decisions around open source. To address this, Mark Giese, our head of Spec, has tried to create a way to talk through who should be trained and why. So he broke it into competence and awareness. And at a very high level, he tried to create language that might replace our current training requirement, which requires 85% of software staff to receive training, to replace that with a more general and generic approach that allows companies who have different inflection points for training to work with OpenChain. Now, this raised some concerns, and this is what I want to talk about during this steering committee meeting. Concern number one, This is the problem statement. So organizations differ in size and structure, and the proposed training provisions could appear cumbersome, off-putting, or more rigid as compared to the current tangible requirements. That said, it is understood that some companies rely more on automation and hard gates to make sure requirements are met, rather than train in detail all software-related roles. Given this, we need to think about having different approaches to achieving conformance when it comes to training. Delivery of actual training, or automation of process to remove the need to have a whole organization training. However, we will need to ensure that those setting up automation of the processes are fully trained to implement the policies and processes required by the specification. In other words, and this is a concern raised by Sami, so Sami, please jump in if I'm paraphrasing incorrectly. But in other words, we might not be looking at training all the software staff. We might be accepting automation, but we would require that those setting up the automation have got training. So we need to make sure that our language stresses very clearly that those responsible for manual or automated actions on compliance are fully trained. And that's language that was not in the first iteration of the training requirement language. Sami, do you think that that approach would fully address your concern around the training issue?
Yes, I think it does. As I said, I just felt that if I'm working for a small startup company, the original language proposed would seem cumbersome and off-putting. And to be honest with you, even middle-sized sort of companies might struggle to do that. So I felt that we need sort of to have multiple options. And I do think that there was somebody else who raised the concern around the automation during our last call. I don't recall who did, but that there was a second sort of concern from somebody who wasn't a voting member.
Yes, I believe there was that concern raised, and adjacent to it, we also had the community representative raise a concern as well.
That's right. But yes, I agree. I think this does address my concern.
Thank you very much indeed, Sami. Does anyone else have anything to raise on this particular point about training the automators and training the decision makers? Everyone's rereading the paragraph. Okay. What I do want to do is to move on to the second concern raised and formally lodged from a voting member of the steering committee. So Sami raised the concern particularly around organization sizes and how we ensure that's clearly understood. The second concern was related to this. This was from Indira Bhatt, our community representative, and her concern was the new training requirement allows an organization to define the roles applied to the compliance program. It is important to provide examples of how such roles could be structured for small, medium, and large companies. Case studies or guidelines should be provided in this area to ensure clarity. It is also important to define concepts like competency across different domains. One way to address this is through reference to certifications for different domains. So Indira's point was that beyond our pure training requirement, we need to provide examples so that people know what they're doing. And that sounds rational. I mean, it's a step in a slightly different direction to what we've done before. You know, we have never tied the concept of having examples to the spec, but it's something to think about. I think someone is unmuted on the line. Passing the floor to you. Okay, maybe no comment on the line, but Michael from Siemens has a comment here.
Thank you. I was wondering, while thinking about it, is it training or is that consulting? Or mentoring or coaching? Or is it subsumed? Maybe you see that as a subsumed concept, like everything, also coaching and mentoring would be part of training? Or is training more like something where you sit in a seminar and more like in a teaching form? But when it comes to talk about this references And these things, it sounds like more of a coaching job to transport this.
That's a very good point. Yeah, I mean, I think originally our training was essentially training slides. That was our concept, but that snowballed. I think the floor is yours.
Sorry, this is David Rudin on the line.
Hello.
Hi, thanks for including me. I think my question is, there's really almost seems like two parts of this, and I'm trying to understand it. One is, providing examples and non-normative information that is helpful, and that seems fine. But then it seems to be requiring an entire cross-section on competency across different domains and reference to certifications through various domains. This very much seems like an exception that can swallow the rule, if you will. So I don't quite know what it means, but it sounds like this could potentially be a major step away from let organizations figure out the right way to do it for what they're doing, to turn into almost an entire subset of rules and regulations on how this has to be done depending on your organization.
That's a really good point. So in essence, the last two sentences there, I believe, are what raised your concern about normative contribution, right? It is also important to define competency, and it's one way to address it is reference to certification. So those are the two kind of normative sentences.
Right.
Do you think if we struck those sentences that it would read well, that it would just be case studies or guidelines?
Yeah, I don't think there's objections to case studies and guidelines, at least from my perspective. But the more helpful material, the better, I think.
Yeah.
But they will be part of the specification, the case studies.
Not part of the spec, just
okay.
Adjacent.
Right.
Yeah.
Also fine to that if we struck the last.
Okay, so if we struck the last two sentences and we explicitly acknowledge that the case studies or guidelines are not tied into the spec, they're just part of our curriculum, do we have consensus that that approach would work for everyone? Yep.
I think that's a good idea.
All right. Thank you. Yeah, no, that's good. Okay, let's strike those two sentences. And at this steering committee meeting, the voting members present, we appear to have no objections or concerns once those two sentences are struck. So thanks for raising that, David. Okay, so concern number one, going back, essentially has now been addressed to everyone's satisfaction. I'm just going to give another opportunity to make sure that we have consensus here. It seems that we have consensus that as long as we make sure that those decision makers for open source compliance or the people creating the automation are trained, we're satisfied with changing the training requirement from its current normative training of software staff into allowing it to be training of different roles. So different roles with the proviso that those have to be the roles that are making decisions.
Will this be reflected in the specification text?
Yes, we'll have to include that in the specification text. So I've just put up on the screen the current proposed specification text to take us into ISO. And this is broken into competence and awareness. And what we're going to do is we're going to refine this language. We're going to make it slightly more specific to make sure that the automators are trained, that the decision makers are trained.
When you asked to introduce the activity of working group, now we are talking about research of this decision system in each company. That will be quite informative to share. May I do it? Okay. We have that is led by Inada-san, but Japan Working Group team is now making some of the mutual case study. What is the open source software related decision was performed in each company? And we are sharing, like Kato-san's case study, we are also making another sharing of each company's internal mechanism to determine the use of the open source software. So that result will be another information to be shared with those kind of people. And maybe it's on the progress so that we do not have any opportunity to show it right now. But maybe later on, we will be able to make some of the English version to share.
That will be really useful. I think that would help with the concern number 2, where we want to have case studies or guidelines to ensure clarity.
And to whom we should reach that kind of information, that kind of consideration, we can use that kind of research.
Great. Okay, so we've got some case studies incoming for point 2.
Sorry, Shane. If you don't mind summarizing, because again, the line, whoever was talking, the line sort of was slightly broken, so it would be useful to have a summary.
Okay, so thanks for letting me know that, Sammy. Here's the basics. The Japan work group is currently creating some case studies about how they do something like frame the training and the responsibilities. So it looks like the Japan work group will be able to contribute some of the case studies to fill out concern 2. The concern number 2 was that we want to provide some examples of how roles could be structured for small, medium, and large companies. So the Japan work group will be providing some examples of how roles are structured. Of course, most of our Japan work group, it's multinationals, so the emphasis will be on large companies. So to summarize very quickly, concern number 1, raised at the last steering committee meeting, was that we don't want to be cumbersome or off-putting. We need to be clear and easy about how training is applied, but the training needs to cover people who are making the decisions or creating the automation. That's one point. Concern number 2, we need to help companies understand who should be trained, because we're not talking about software staff anymore. We're slightly broader. We're saying people who are responsible. So to address that, we need to have some case studies to provide examples of the roles. But we need to avoid being normative. So we don't want to define competency. We don't want to reference certification for domains.
Just a question about I start thinking company. So for the persons who implement automation, would that be, for example, the basic compliance training like LF 191? Is that the kind of amount of training that persons think about? Or that would be the intent behind it, or one possible implementation?
I think what we could say is that something like the Linux Foundation training would be one possible reference, but we don't want to say that's the level you have to have, because people might have very different pictures. For example, some companies might want much more simple training, and some companies have much heavier training.
Shane, could I ask you that you go back to the previous slide for a moment?
Sure.
I had a question. So this first concern talks about we will need to ensure that those setting up the automation of the processes are fully trained to implement the policy and process. But when you're speaking, you're also saying those who are setting it up and decision makers. I just want to clarify what's actually being proposed here.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So in the first language about the training requirements that Mark brought up, he was essentially talking about the decision makers. And then the addition was that we need to ensure that those setting up the automation are trained as well. So, and Sammy, please let me know if I've got this wrong, but Sammy's main emphasis was to ensure that those creating automation are trained, because we already had some language for ensuring that people who are making decisions are trained.
That is correct, Shane. And again, just to put it into context, obviously today we say all software staff or 85% of software staff need to be trained, and that obviously would include anybody who is involved in the release of the supplied software. The expectation is that by saying, okay, so if you have an automated process that ensures the compliance, you just need to make sure that those who are setting up that process are trained and the decision makers in the organizations are fully trained. Because at the end of it, your organization will be conformant, because whatever you're supplying will be conformant to the specification.
David, yeah, over to you.
Not exactly. I'm trying to see where this language about decision makers is, and I think I might just be missing that.
Right. So the first bullet is not decision maker. Whoever affects.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah. I'm having trouble hearing whoever's speaking.
So it's 1.1a. So it's roles that affect the performance and effectiveness of the FOSS compliance program. That's the language that sets the stage for decision makers. But you're right that, yeah. What we might need to do is to tighten that language up, I guess.
Actually, I think I'm comfortable with the language as is. But, just to, different organizations have different structures. There could literally be thousands of decision makers in an organization. And so I think allowing the organizations to define, 1.1a makes sense, but trying to define a decision maker is extremely difficult.
Yeah, I agree with that. In the current language, whoever affects may be the implementer or the automated policy generator.
So I would read this as those who are responsible for the compliance program. So, for example, in my organization, there would be, for instance, somebody who might be in the open source office. I would expect people in the open source office to be fully capable and trained and able to make those decisions. Other companies might have business people scattered who approve the release of software, and which incorporates open source. So those people need to be aware of what they're approving, and I think that's where we said it is important that the decision makers relating to the compliance program are the ones who must be trained.
So just to pull that together, do we have consensus that everyone's happy with 1.1a, which is roles and responsibilities of people that affect the performance and effectiveness of the program? So, yeah, no objections on that.
The latest version was gets rid of FOSS.
That's right. As a side note, FOSS has been removed from the OpenChain project. We're only using the term open source. Yeah. Okay, so everyone's happy with 1.1a, and just making sure then that we add in something about people who set up the automation are fully trained. And number 2, and I noticed that Indira is on the line, so this was the concern raised by Indira, and that we allow people to define the roles, but we need to have case studies or guidelines to help people understand how that can be done. What we had was consensus that case studies or guidelines are a good idea. It's non-normative, but there's a concern about the final 2 sentences, defining competency and referencing certifications, that those would be too normative for us. So Indira, on your side, are you comfortable with proceeding that we have case studies or guidelines, but that we do not attempt to define competency or reference specific certifications? We in general seem to have consensus that might be too normative, but I wanted to check your opinion. Okay. No opinion from Indira. All right. So my reading of this is that we have consensus about how to move forward. 1.1a stays. We ensured language about making sure that people who do automation are trained is added. And we work as a project to create case studies. But we avoid defining competency, and we avoid referencing specific certifications for domains. All right. Any objections or further comments around the spec training requirements? I'm gathering there are none. I'm just going to show one slide as we begin to wrap up the steering committee. We have OpenChain organization definition. In essence, with ISO on the left, it has 4 points. We currently have 2. At the last steering committee meeting, we agreed to essentially proceed with adopting what ISO does around ISO 9001, so that we do not prescribe the scope, and an organization is required to define the document scope. So is everyone still comfortable with basically proceeding along the same lines of ISO 9001, 2015? I'm guessing if there are no objections, everyone is fully comfortable, and we just proceed as planned.
Sounds good, Shane.
Alrighty. We now have, by my reading, full consensus regarding the next step of the OpenChain training requirement, and we have continued consensus regarding the OpenChain organization definition. That's all of the business of the steering committee. These recommendations will be passed to the governing board of the OpenChain project, and we can expect that these will represent exactly what we're going to be doing moving forward into 2019. Exciting time. I believe that this language will set up the specification quite neatly for moving into our ISO fast-track submission process. Any other business for the steering committee today? Is there anything you'd like to see us discuss or vote on in advance of the governing board meeting?
Of course, it is not required some sort of debugging or some budget request, but in near future, I hope to raise one issue to keep some of the budget to prepare the document, which I have mentioned during the workshop. That is a document to tell to the upstream, counterpart people.
Yes, absolutely. When it comes to the budgeting, I think that a documentation regarding supporting upstream people, that would fall under a marketing budget for OpenChain. So that's one of the items we would confirm through the governing board meeting.
So anyway, we do not have any concrete estimate of the cost or some of the grand picture of what we are going to do, so that we try to come back at that kind of discussion in another later at another opportunity.
That's a really good point. So before we could cost out the marketing requirement, we probably need the work teams to work on this. Maybe on this kind of side note about the production of materials for the OpenChain project, our open workshop session suggested that there's a lot of material that people want. And some of it we can create in the community, some of it we might want to put some budget on to have created to some extent by, let's say, marketing people and or design people. For example, when we do the case studies, we might want to put aside budget for making that nice and pretty. Okay, so I'm going to give an action item to the Japan work group regarding these documentations raised by the Japanese companies. If you could come back to us for the next steering committee meeting with it. Yeah. Oh, well, yeah, that would work. But the next steering committee meeting for votes will be in approximately 3 months. So around January. If the work group could come back to us and just let us know what type of documents you're interested in that we would want to advocate to the board for marketing. All right. If there's no other business, we're going to wrap it up here. I'm going to give about 5 minutes. So we're going to start at 5:05 UK time, 9:05 Pacific time, with the actual board meeting of the OpenChain project. For the board meeting, I would like to invite our board members to be present. And for those who have been invited as observers, You're welcome to be present. For everyone else, thank you for your time. It's been wonderful to have you as part of our steering committee meeting and our more general workshop. I believe that what we've touched on now is a laundry list of items for us to do in advance of the end of the year. So let's get to it. Thank you for your time. We reconvene at 5:05 UK time, 9:05 Pacific.